2:17 a.m. I opened my eyes slowly, too weak to lift my head off the pillow. A bitter taste of medicine in my mouth, dim light coming from the hallway, a thin curtain separating me from the rest of the room. My body felt heavy, drugged, almost like it no longer belonged to me, but my ears, for some reason, were still awake. On the other side of the curtain, two voices. One of them was my mother's. She can't know. I froze. These tests don't match. My breathing grew shorter. Then came the sentence that turned my blood cold. If she remembers before discharge, it's over for us. Us. Not it's over for me. It's over for us. I tried to make sense of it, but my mind was still floating between sleep and fear. The last sentence came lower, almost a whisper. She can't go back to that house. My heart started pounding so hard I was afraid it would show up on the monitor beside the bed. That was when I noticed a sudden silence behind the curtain, as if someone had sensed I was listening. Footsteps. The curtain opened, and there was Beatrice, my mother, her face tense, her eyes hard for 1 second, just 1 second, before they transformed into something completely different, a smile. Soft, sweet, protective. "Are you awake, sweetheart?" she said, in the gentlest voice I had ever heard from her. "Rest. Everything's fine." I wanted to believe her. Part of me, trained for 27 years, wanted so badly to believe her. But my body was still trembling with the echo of that sentence. It's over for us. That was when Dr. Adrian Blackwell came into my field of vision, on the other side of the bed, adjusting the IV drip. A common gesture, a routine gesture, except his hands were shaking. He leaned in slightly, as if checking the tape on my arm, and I felt something small and folded pressed into the palm of my hand. I closed my fingers around it by instinct. He didn't look at me. He just whispered, so quietly, it almost got lost in the hum of the machine beside me. "Don't go home with your mother." My entire body froze. I looked at Beatrice, on the other side of the room. She was still smiling. The same smile as always, calm, sweet, protective. Except that, for the first time in my entire life, that smile didn't look like care. It looked like a threat. My name was Natalie Greystone. At least, that's what I had believed my whole life. I was 27 years old, worked as an elementary school teacher in Hawthorne Creek, and lived in the same old house where I grew up. To everyone in town, my mother was a model widow, a strong woman who had given up her own life to care for her sick daughter. At church, she was respected. At school, she was seen as a devoted mother. Among the neighbors, she was practically a saint, but no one saw what happened when our front door closed. Since I was a child, Beatrice had told me I had a rare blood condition. According to her, I was too fragile to live alone, too sensitive to travel, too unstable to drive long distances, and too vulnerable to trust doctors who didn't know my history. I grew up taking pills I never questioned. When I felt dizzy, she said it was my illness. When I forgot conversations, she said it was the effect of my condition. When my legs felt weak, she said it was exactly why I needed her. When I tried to dream of a life far from there, she would place her hand on my face and say, "You wouldn't survive a week without me." And I believed her. I believed her when I turned down a scholarship out of state. I believed her when I ended a relationship because she said he wanted to pull me away from the family. I believed her when I stopped traveling with friends, when I gave up living on my own, when I agreed to keep sleeping in the same bedroom, in the same house, in the same routine, with the same pills next to the bed. My entire life had been built around the idea that my mother was protecting me from the world. There were days when I tried to recall some simple joy, something that was mine alone, without Beatrice's shadow watching. I couldn't. Every good memory I had came paired with her presence, as if my whole childhood had been lived inside a glass dome she herself had designed. There were also the small rituals that, back then, I called care, and that today I recognize as disguised surveillance. Every morning, before I left for the school where I worked, Beatrice would check my bag. She said it was to make sure I didn't forget my medication. In truth, it was to make sure I wasn't carrying anything that could connect me to anyone outside the small circle she controlled. She chose my clothes, saying certain colors affected my blood pressure. She chose my sleep schedule, saying certain routines protected my condition. She even chose which books I could read, claiming stories that were too intense made my memory worse. I didn't realize the size of the cage because its bars were made of worry, not iron. My coworkers sometimes remarked, kindly, that it was strange I never showed up to gatherings outside school hours. I always had an excuse ready, borrowed from my mother's voice: tiredness, tests, medication that required a strict schedule. Little by little, I isolated myself without realizing I was being isolated. Until the day I fainted at school. I was telling my students a story when I felt the floor shift. I tried to steady myself against the desk, but my fingers wouldn't obey. The last thing I saw before I blacked out was the frightened face of a child calling my name. When I woke up at Mercyvale General Hospital, Beatrice was already there. That was the first strange thing. She arrived too fast. Before I could even explain what I had felt, my mother was already answering for me. She told the doctor this had been happening since childhood. She handed over a folder with old medical records. She talked about my illness, my medications, my limits, my routine. I lay on the gurney, listening to my own story come out of her mouth as if I wasn't even there. Dr. Adrian Blackwell didn't seem convinced. He asked me questions directly, but Beatrice always jumped in first. When he asked what medications I took, she answered. When he asked when the fainting spells began, she answered. When he asked if I'd had any recent tests, she answered before I could open my mouth. At the time, I thought that was normal. My mother always did that. But Adrian started to notice. He looked at my current test results. Then he looked at the old documents. Then he looked at me in a different way, as if trying to figure out who in that room was actually sick. Later, I found out there were serious inconsistencies in my medical history. The rare disease Beatrice claimed I had didn't show up in any tests. Some of the medications listed on my chart made no sense together. There were impossible dates, old signatures, stamps from clinics that no longer existed, and one detail that changed everything. My blood type appeared different across records from different periods. That was why, in the early hours of that morning, when my mother stepped out of the room for a few minutes to take a call, Adrian slipped the note into my hand. On the paper, a hastily written sentence. Your blood doesn't match the old records. Look for file 638D. I spent the rest of the night pretending to sleep. My mother sat beside the bed, watching my every move. Sometimes she'd ask if I wanted water, then if I was in pain, then if the doctor had said anything strange. Her voice stayed soft, her eyes didn't. I lay there, motionless, counting the seconds between one question and the next, trying to figure out what was hiding behind that care that suddenly felt more like surveillance than love. The next morning, I made the hardest decision of my life. I went home with her, not because I trusted her, but because I needed to find out the truth. I smiled, accepted the discharge, let Beatrice hold my arm, and hid the note inside the sole of my shoe. When we walked into the house, everything looked the same. The smell of lavender in the hallway, the old photographs on the walls, the kettle on the stove, the living room clock marking time with that low sound that had followed me since childhood. Except something had changed. Me. For the first time, I didn't see that house as home. I saw it as a prison that had learned to look cozy. I started noticing details I used to ignore. The basement door that was always kept locked, the boxes in the attic my mother never let anyone touch, the nightstand drawer where she kept my pills out of their original packaging, the childhood photos that only began when I already looked about 3 years old, the baby picture with part of the hospital bracelet cut off. For days, I pretended to be the same obedient daughter. When Beatrice handed me the pills, I would put them in my mouth, drink water, and then hide them under my tongue until I could spit them out down the bathroom drain, into the soil of the potted plants, into the pocket of my robe. One afternoon, I was almost caught. Beatrice walked into my room without knocking, as she always did, right at the moment I was trying to push the pill into my sleeve. She stopped in the doorway. She said nothing for a second that felt like it lasted a lifetime. Then she stepped closer, slowly, and sat on the edge of my bed. She didn't yell. She didn't accuse. She just smiled that same smile as always and asked, in the sweetest voice I had ever heard, "Are you having trouble swallowing again, sweetheart?" My heart stopped. She reached out and touched my chin, lifting my face to look straight into my eyes, the way she used to when I was a child and lying about some mischief. "Open your mouth for Mummy." I opened it. She examined it for a moment that felt eternal, then smiled again, satisfied, and said she'd bring me an easier pill to swallow next time. She stood up, smoothed her skirt, and left the room as if nothing had happened. Only after the door closed did I notice my hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the pill hidden in my sleeve. That night, I understood something that changed the way I moved through that house. Beatrice didn't need to shout to control me. The fear she caused came exactly from her calm, from her sweetness, from the quiet certainty of someone who knows she's in control and doesn't need to prove it to anyone. From then on, I moved with double the caution. I learned to notice when a drawer was an inch out of place, a sign she had searched my room. I learned to notice when the dust on a box had been slightly disturbed. I learned that she'd change my medication schedule without warning, just to test whether I'd notice, whether I'd complain, whether somehow I was more alert than I should have been. The house that once felt like home increasingly felt like a surveillance room disguised as comfort. But in the middle of the night, I investigated. I wrote down schedules. I photographed documents. I searched for keys. I went through drawers with trembling hands. Every small detail seemed to pull me toward a truth I didn't know if I'd have the courage to face. One night, I found an old notebook hidden behind cookbooks with Beatrice's notes about maintenance doses and behavior under control. There wasn't a single medical term in it. These were the notes of someone monitoring another person, not caring for a patient. I closed the notebook with my heart racing and put everything back exactly where it had been, afraid she'd notice even the dust out of place. Then, something unexpected happened. As I stopped taking the pills, my mind began to clear. The dizziness lessened. My legs grew steadier. The memory lapses became less frequent, and some memories began coming back in pieces. Broken headlights in the rain, a woman screaming my name, the smell of wet smoke, a lullaby my mother never sang, glass scattered across the asphalt. I didn't know if these were real memories or old nightmares, but one thing became clear. My life hadn't started where Beatrice said it started. Sometimes these images came in the middle of the day while I washed dishes or swept the hallway, and I'd have to grip the sink to keep from falling. They weren't dreams. They were fragments of something my body remembered, even as my mind still resisted believing it. While I searched for answers inside the house, Dr. Adrian Blackwell tried to access file 638D, the number he himself had scrawled onto that note. The file wouldn't open. In the hospital system, it showed up as restricted pending internal audit, a flag that, according to Adrian, shouldn't exist for a record from that era. He checked the access history and discovered something that sent a chill down his spine. The file had been locked just a few hours after that early morning in my room, as if someone, somewhere inside the hospital itself, had been tipped off that Adrian was looking for it. Someone was still protecting that secret. Someone who wasn't Beatrice, because Beatrice hadn't had access to that system in years. Adrian became more careful after that, knowing that every question he asked might be watched by eyes he still couldn't identify. That's how he came to look for someone from the past. Eleanor Whitlock, a retired nurse who had worked at Mercyvale General Hospital nearly 3 decades earlier. Eleanor had moved far from town after losing her job for trying to report a missing child. At first, she refused to talk, but when Adrian showed her a photo of me, she went pale. She was the one who revealed the first part of the truth. 27 years earlier, on a stormy night, 2 young children were brought to the hospital after an accident on the road near Hollow Ridge Bridge. One of them died, the other survived. But before the final paperwork was completed, the surviving girl disappeared. The case was buried. The missing child's name was Vivian Calderidge. When Adrian told me that, I felt as if someone had ripped the floor out from under me. Vivian Calderidge was the daughter of Rosalind Calderidge, a woman connected to one of the region's most influential families, and Malcolm Calderidge, a powerful businessman who controlled businesses, donations, properties, and part of local politics. It was only when I heard the full last name that it clicked. Malcolm Calderidge, the same name engraved in gold letters on the wall of the school where I taught, the same name on the plaques at the hospital where I had just been admitted. The man whose name was on the wall of the school where I taught was the same man who paid to erase my true name. He wasn't some distant stranger, the way I had imagined my whole life. He had been close to me the entire time, present in every corner of my routine, without me ever knowing that golden name on the walls was, in fact, the price paid for my silence. At the time, Malcolm had a spotless reputation. His foundation was growing, his public career was being carefully built. The existence of that child, born from a relationship he wanted erased, could destroy everything. So Vivian was taken out of her own life, recorded as dead to some, hidden as another woman's daughter to others, and raised under a new name, Natalie Greystone, me. The truth got even worse when I discovered that Beatrice wasn't simply an adoptive mother who had hidden a secret out of fear. She had worked as a temporary administrative assistant at the hospital during that same period, right when the accident happened. Single, recently widowed, emotionally broken, and desperate to be a mother, she was the perfect person to take in the child Malcolm wanted to make disappear. At first, maybe she accepted it for money. Later, she turned my existence into an obsession. To make sure I never found out who I really was, Beatrice invented an illness. She controlled my doctors, forged prescriptions, manipulated lab reports, chose which people I was allowed to know, destroyed my attempts at independence, used medication to keep me weak, confused, and dependent. Every pill I swallowed thinking it was care was, in truth, a chain. When Adrian showed me the first documents Eleanor had kept hidden for years, yellowed copies of hospital records, a nursing report that had never been officially filed, I felt torn between 2 lives that didn't fit together. One was Natalie's life, quiet, obedient, full of pills. The other was the life of a girl named Vivian, who might have survived an accident that should have killed her. I needed proof that couldn't be denied. In the days that followed, I started piecing things together more carefully. I noticed Beatrice always tensed up whenever I mentioned the word hospital, even in casual contexts. I noticed she never talked about the day she adopted me, as if that were a deleted detail from our official story. I noticed every photograph from my supposed childhood had been taken inside the house, never in public places, never with other children, never with witnesses. Every well-built lie has a blind spot, and Beatrice's was silence. She never told spontaneous stories about my birth, never laughed remembering some funny moment from my early years. When I asked, she always deflected with the same rehearsed line. It was a hard time I don't like remembering, and I, first as a child and later as an adult, always accepted that as respect for her grief. Now I saw it wasn't grief. It was fear of slipping up on her own lie. The turning point came when I found the forbidden room. At the end of the hallway there was a door my mother always said was full of my late father's belongings. I never questioned it. That night, while Beatrice slept, I found a hidden key inside an old tin in the pantry and opened the door for the first time. Inside, there were no grieving keepsakes. There was proof. A metal box was hidden behind a false section of the wall. Inside it, I found old receipts, copies of bank transfers, an altered birth certificate, newspaper clippings about the Hollow Ridge accident, and letters Rosalind Calderidge had never sent. My biological mother. In one of the letters, Rosalind described her baby daughter with a detail impossible to ignore. A small crescent moon-shaped mark near the left shoulder. I had that mark. In that instant, the doubt ended. I wasn't just a controlled daughter. I was a stolen child. And my mother knew it. I sat on the floor of that dusty room, surrounded by papers telling an entire life that wasn't the one I had lived, and I cried in silence, afraid that even the sound of my crying could betray me. I was still holding the letters when I heard the floorboards creak behind me. Beatrice was in the doorway. For the first time, she didn't try to pretend everything was fine. Her face went pale. Her eyes went straight to the metal box, then to the letters in my hands, then to me. She said my name as if she still had the right to own it. Natalie. But I didn't answer. Because, in that moment, I no longer knew if that name was mine or just part of the lie. The scene turned into a confrontation I will never forget. Beatrice cried, trembled, tried to come closer, tried to hug me. She said she'd done it all out of love. She said Malcolm wanted to erase me. She said Rosalind would never have been able to protect me. She said the world would have destroyed me. I listened to all of it with my biological mother's letters pressed against my chest. Then I asked, "If it was love, why did you drug me?" She fell silent. It only lasted a few seconds, but that silence said more than any confession could have. Then the mask fell. Beatrice said I was too curious, too stubborn, too much like Rosalind. She said that if I had left, someone would have taken me from her. She said I didn't understand what it meant to love someone enough to do anything not to lose them. That's when I understood. She had never been afraid I would die. She was afraid I would be free. When she tried to take the metal box from my hands, I ran. I flew down the stairs, nearly falling, locked myself in the bathroom, and sent photos of the documents to Dr. Adrian Blackwell. Beatrice pounded on the door. First, she asked me to open it. Then, she cried. Then, she screamed. Then, she said a sentence that never left my head. "You're nothing without me." But this time, I didn't believe it. I sat on the cold bathroom floor, my back against the door, listening to the pounding and the screaming on the other side, and I felt, for the first time in 27 years, that I had control of my own story. A few minutes later, sirens lit up the windows of the house. Adrian didn't come alone. He arrived with Eleanor Whitlock, an estate investigator who had quietly reopened the case after receiving copies of the falsified test results. When the front door was opened by the police, Beatrice still tried to argue, still tried to explain, still tried to use that same soft voice that had convinced me for an entire lifetime. But this time, she wasn't the only one anyone was listening to. Beatrice's downfall didn't happen quietly. Malcolm Calderidge's downfall didn't either. The case reached the county courthouse, and the entire town discovered what had been hidden for 27 years. Malcolm tried to deny everything. He showed up with expensive lawyers, an impeccable posture, and the same calm voice of a man who had spent his life being obeyed. He said he was the victim of an old misunderstanding. He said documents could be misinterpreted. He said his family was being attacked by opportunists. He didn't fall on the first day. His legal team managed to delay hearings, question the chain of custody of the documents, suggest that Eleanor held a personal grudge against the hospital. For an entire week, Malcolm kept appearing in public as if nothing were happening, cutting another ribbon at a foundation opening, smiling for the cameras, as if the truth could simply be ignored until it grew tired of existing. But the documents kept coming. Beatrice tried to present herself as a desperate mother who had simply raised an abandoned child. During the days of the trial, old witnesses began to come forward. A neighbor from the time of the accident confirmed seeing a woman hitchhiking on the road near Hollow Ridge on the same stormy night. The car carrying Vivian and the other child was destroyed. A retired records clerk recognized the handwriting on one of the falsified registration forms. Every new witness was another stone in the foundation of the lie that had held up my entire life. And with each testimony, I felt the ground grow a little steadier beneath my feet, as if the truth finally had enough weight to stand on its own. It was only when a former accountant for the foundation decided to hand over old transfer records made out to shell companies that traced back to Beatrice that Malcolm's impeccable composure began to crack. In front of the cameras, for the first time, he hesitated before answering a simple question. That hesitation, broadcast live, was the first public sign that control was slipping from his hands. But the evidence spoke louder. The old test results showed the identity switch. The bank transfers linked Malcolm to Beatrice. Rosalind's letters proved my biological mother had never given up on me. Eleanor's testimony revealed that the hospital had covered up the disappearance. And Dr. Adrian Blackwell's note became the small piece of paper that kept me from going home without knowing that could have been my last chance to escape. On the day Rosalind Calderidge walked into the courtroom for the first time, I didn't know what to feel. She was older than I had imagined, her graying hair pulled into a simple bun, her eyes red from decades of crying without ever giving up the search. For 27 years, she had been called unstable, obsessive, incapable of accepting the official story that her daughter had died that stormy night. Doctors had suggested therapy for grief, they said. She refused to move past. Investigators had stopped returning her calls. And still, she never stopped believing I was alive somewhere. When our eyes met, she raised a hand to her mouth and whispered my real name out loud for the first time in front of everyone. Vivian. I didn't run to hug her. I still couldn't. There were too many years of doubt between us. An entire life built on a lie I first needed to understand before I could feel anything beyond shock. During the hearing, Beatrice looked at me as if she still expected me to defend her. As if, after everything, I was still that fragile daughter who needed her approval just to breathe. But I stood up and said, in front of everyone, "You called me your daughter, so you wouldn't have to call me evidence." Beatrice broke down. Malcolm lost the foundation, the reputation, and the public protection he had used for so many years. The hospital came under investigation. Beatrice was arrested for kidnapping, document fraud, medical falsification, and prolonged abuse. And Rosalind Calderidge's voice, which for decades had been dismissed as delusion, as the obsession of a woman who couldn't accept her loss, finally returned to the record as the voice of a mother who never stopped searching for her daughter. The local press covered the case for weeks. Reporters called the school where I worked, tried talking to neighbors, published stories with sensational headlines about the hidden heiress of Hollow Ridge. At first, it suffocated me. I hadn't asked to become news. I just wanted to understand who I was, without strangers picking apart every detail of my life in forums and social media comments. Over time, I learned to use that exposure to my advantage. I agreed to give a single interview, carefully prepared with a lawyer's help, not to satisfy other people's curiosity, but to make sure the story was told accurately, without sensationalism, without turning Beatrice into a soap opera villain or me into a fragile victim. I wanted people to understand the mechanics of the abuse, not just the scandal. I received messages from other people who recognized pieces of their own lives in my story. Women who had also grown up convinced they had illnesses they didn't have. Grown children who only realized as adults how much their childhoods had been shaped by fear disguised as care. Every message reminded me that, as lonely as my journey had felt inside that house, I wasn't the only one who had lived through something like it. In the months that followed, I learned to rebuild my life in small pieces. I learned to drive alone, without anyone deciding whether I was well enough for it. I learned to book real doctor's appointments, with physicians who answered my questions instead of answering for me. Slowly, I learned to trust my own memory, even when it still came back in incomplete fragments. Rosalind and I started slowly, short lunches, brief phone calls, no tight hugs, no attempt to make up for all that lost time at once. The pain between us was too great for that, and we both knew it. At our first meeting outside the courtroom, she didn't try to touch me. She sat across the table, her hands wrapped tightly around a cup of tea that went cold without her taking a single sip, just watching me, as if she was still afraid I would disappear again if she blinked. "I don't expect you to call me Mom," she said, her voice trembling. "I just wanted to be able to look at you long enough to believe you're real." I didn't know what to feel either. There was no anger toward her, because she had never done anything but search. But there also wasn't, yet, the instant kind of love people expect to see in stories like this. There was only recognition, a careful kind of care, the kind that builds slowly, brick by brick, with no rush to finish building. She never tried to make up for the 27 lost years, and maybe that's exactly why I was able to let her in, little by little. At one of those lunches, she brought a small, worn box, its corners dented from being taken in and out of drawers over the years. Inside was a baby rattle, a pair of white shoes gone yellow with age, and a blurry photograph of a young woman holding a child, smiling at the camera with a smile I recognized, without ever having seen it before, as looking like my own. "I kept these things for 27 years, she said, her voice shaking more than she probably wanted it to. "Not because I really had hope. I kept them because if I threw them away, it would be like admitting you had really died." I couldn't answer right away. I just held the rattle between my fingers, feeling the strange weight of an object that should have meant something to me, and that, at the same time, belonged to a life I had never consciously lived. It was at that lunch that Rosalind told me, for the first time, about the night of the accident. She hadn't been in the car. A last-minute argument with Malcolm had kept her from traveling with the children that night, a decision she would carry as guilt for the rest of her life, even knowing, rationally, that it made no sense to blame herself for something someone else had orchestrated. "I spent years going to police stations, to hospitals, hiring private investigators," she said. "Everyone told me the same thing, that it was a closed case, that there was nothing to investigate. I knew they were lying. A mother always knows." Those words stayed with me for weeks. I started therapy with a psychologist who specialized in Munchausen syndrome by proxy, the clinical name for what Beatrice had done to me my entire life. I learned that what I had lived through had a recognized pattern, that other people had gone through similar experiences, that the confusion I felt caught between gratitude and rage, between missing a lie and feeling relieved by the truth, was common among survivors of that kind of abuse. Little by little, I understood I didn't have to choose between hating Beatrice completely or feeling sorry for her. I could acknowledge the damage she caused and still move forward without carrying that weight as if it were mine. I also went back to see Dr. Adrian Blackwell, months after everything had been settled in court. I found him at a small cafe near the hospital where it had all begun. He seemed lighter than he had that night he slipped the note into my hand, as if he'd carried the weight of that secret for weeks before finally being able to set it down. I almost didn't do it, he admitted, turning his coffee cup between his hands. I could have lost my job. I could have been sued for defamation if I'd been wrong. But something in your tests didn't add up, and I couldn't sleep thinking you might be sent back to somewhere dangerous without anyone saying a word. I thanked him the only way I knew how, by telling him what happened afterward. I told him about the forbidden room, about Rosalind's letters, about Beatrice's arrest, about the new name, or rather, the old name I could finally use without fear. He smiled, but there was sadness in it too. I wish I could say cases like yours are rare, he said, but after yours, I started looking at other patients' histories differently. Sometimes all it takes is one reason to start paying attention. I also went back to see Eleanor Whitlock, the nurse who had lost her job decades earlier for trying to report my disappearance. She lived in a small house, surrounded by a well-tended garden, far from the noise of the city. When I arrived at her door, I didn't quite know what to say. How do you thank someone who carried the guilt of a forced silence for almost 30 years? I tried, she said, before I could even speak. I swear I tried to warn the right people. No one wanted to listen to a nursing assistant against a name like Calderidge. I held her hand and said the only thing that felt true enough to fill that decades-long silence. You tried when no one else did. That means more than you know. She cried, and I cried with her, right there on the porch of that small house. Two women who never should have had to meet each other that way, bound together by an injustice that had finally been made right, even though it was too late to undo the years that were lost. Months later, I visited Beatrice in prison. I didn't go to forgive her. I went to close the door. She looked older, smaller, without the control she had always held inside that house. Even so, she tried to use the same sentence she had repeated my entire life. I only wanted to protect you. I set the doctor's note down on the table, worn at the edges by now, and answered, No, you wanted me to be afraid of the world, but the first person who ever told me to run was trying to save me from you. She cried. This time, I didn't reach out my hand. I stood up, put the note back in my pocket, and walked out of that room without looking back. Not because I felt nothing, but because, for the first time, what I felt was no longer fear. Eventually, I legally reclaimed my true name, Vivian Calderidge, but I didn't erase Natalie Greystone completely. Because Natalie was the girl who survived without understanding the prison she was living in. Natalie was the young woman who obeyed because she was afraid. Natalie was the woman who hid pills, opened forbidden doors, ran with proof in her hands, and decided to live. In the end, I walked into my first apartment in another city, far from the old house, far from the pills, far from the lies. I set Rosalind's letters down on a small table. I opened the window. I breathe without hurry. For the first time, no one is calling my name down the hallway. For the first time, no one is telling me I'm too fragile to exist on my own. Then I look at my reflection in the glass and say quietly, My name is Vivian Calderidge. But Natalie was the one who kept me alive until I discovered the truth.